Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price but stay for the service.
And we're back, and we are moving into our first conversation for this morning. As was mentioned earlier, today we are joined by representatives of the Council of Churches to discuss their recent positions that they have taken on the legalization of marijuana and on the salary cuts for teachers. And here with us this morning, we have Bishop Philip Wright from the Anglican Diocese of Belize, and we have Bishop Moses Ben-Gushev from the Belize Council of Churches. Good morning.
Good morning, Melanie. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, good morning.
It's good to be with you as always. It's been a while, but...
I know, in person especially.
In person especially.
Right? But it's wonderful to have you here and to be able to initiate the discussion on the church's perspective. So there was a press release that was issued last week, and I think it's important for us to understand what motivated the Council of Churches to come together to put out their position.
Yeah. I think, Marlene, the best place to begin is to look at all of this in terms of this relationship between church and state that we have cherished for decades. And it's a relationship really between the church and the government being one government that is administered from time to time by different parties and so on. So we really see the relationship between church and state government. We value that relationship. We believe that relationship has served the country well. It has not been a perfect relationship, as I'm not sure there are any such, but it has been a good relationship. From the early days, we just had emancipation, from the early days when the church stepped in and opened schools, and right to this day when we're involved, we have a senator, we're involved in the administration, in the governance. We value this relationship, and I think whenever we see that relationship, how could I put it, sort of under threat, or if not under threat, not being understood properly, then we feel it's time to have a conversation again. I liken it sometimes to even the relationship we share with each other, husband, wife, whatever. Trust me, there comes a time, sometimes you have to sit down and say, you know what, let's talk about it. Do we still understand this thing the same way? Do we still feel the same way about each other? And those sort of, and I think this is what this is all about. Now it has been driven, yes, by some recent incidents. One being, as you said, the teacher salary situation, the marijuana situation. But I would rather we look at it really in terms of that broader context of the relationship between church and state and moving forward.
So on that point, tell me what is different with this particular administration and the relationship with the church versus what you had before.
I don't think there is a difference, really, to be honest. Because when you look at the history of the church and its involvement with the different administrations, for decades, we've always called out something if we're not comfortable. I think in this moment, given the nature of everything that is happening and the recent fight with unions and so on, it has maybe garnered a greater attention from the media, but I wouldn't say that the relationship is any different. But
is the engagement the same?
Yes, I would say that perhaps maybe the mode of communication is perhaps something that we need to look at again. How has the communication been? And you know, from communication, how do each party understand what was communicated? And then as communication continues, how that communication of whatever agreements were made, how that is communicated to the public. And so I think that aspect perhaps needs some looking at and some refining insofar as we are concerned.
No, I have been going over some of the archives, and I was going over particularly an archive from, I believe, last week or the week before, where you gave a statement to Channel 5 and saying that the churches were not consulted regarding a particular issue of the legalization of marijuana. speak to us about the communications there between the churches and the government and what that's like.
Yes, and if I may, because this is not something, as I mentioned from the outset, it is not something that started with this present administration.
Yeah.
It is something that was there before. And so insofar as that aspect is concerned, it is one where previous administration, or at least the past administration, would have had some kind of dialogue with the church. And Bishop Wright can speak to that issue. But insofar as I know, that there would have been some level of communication at that point. There would have, and the communication would have been at least in some part to have at least consulted with the church as to the position that the government was taking, but also to have engaged the church. And but in recent statements, we have heard, especially what this present administration is putting forward. We have heard, for example, well, you know, we really do not have to consult the church again because they had already taken a position previously. And what we are saying, but even if that is so, can you engage the church? Because it is also that we would have been proactive in a sense, and the discussion amongst ourselves would have continued. And there are some things that we have said, okay, there are some things we need to look at as a church.
But Bishop, could it not be argued that given the fact that in Belize, the church is given a prominent role in decision making, in the role of a senator, which
That's
you sit
correct.
as, and you have that opportunity at that point to be able to speak out and even to have a firm position on any bill that is passed?
Yes, and that is so. But at the same time, even as I speak as senator, there's some consultation that takes place, and within the church, you know, we have we have our own understanding of some things too. And so, while I take a certain position as senator, I also have to be doing some consultation within my own body, and I think that consultation, because it is so active, you know, needs from time to time to be shared with the other body, which would be the government.
And one must bear in mind too that at the level of the Senate has never been the only level at which the dialogue has taken place. I mean, there have been times when the Prime Minister has come and met with us personally, and that's what we're saying, that this relationship is more than just one aspect. And when you see the overall relationship changing, let's say, for lack of a better word, then you do have to say, hey, let's talk about it. And by the way, I will say quickly, before I forget, we're hoping to have a meeting with the Prime Minister soon, and to talk through some of the concerns we've expressed, his take on it, and in a recent communication with him, for instance, both of us recommitted ourselves to the relationship. So we're not here to say this relationship is about to be severed. We're just saying, as we move forward with these important issues that are affecting us as a nation, and if you consider the church a viable partner, a stakeholder, then we need to have open, honest, candid conversations about it.
Minister Fonseca has expressed the same publicly, that they expect that a subsequent meeting will take place. But let's dive into the issue at hand.
So, but just before that though, seeing that we're at this point, and as Bishop has spoken in that regard, and you mentioned Minister Fonseca, that as mentioned that communication in the area of education, and I must go on record to say that because I have been a part of that, that the communication insofar as schools are concerned and education is concerned, insofar as the Minister of Education is concerned, you know, that aspect has gone rather smoothly. And we're happy for that.
So it sounds to be more of an engagement issue as well. But let's bring it back to the position that you've taken on the marijuana, the proposed changes to the bill.
Right.
What is your concern? What is the position that the church is putting forward and why?
Well, I think a large part of the church's concern with the marijuana, the legalization, is we also look down the road. Now we've heard of the financial justification. We've heard of other things being put forward to sort of justify why we need to go in this direction. However, we also know that, as with other drugs, as with alcohol, as with tobacco, we've seen sometimes the sad side effects of these things down the road. And the church is often at the forefront of that intervention. And so what you're seeing here in our statement on the marijuana issue is we feel that further consideration, other things need to be brought into the fray in order for us to move in this direction. Bishop Benguishe will tell you, specific to our churches, we share some differences sometimes, within the Council of Churches.
I was going to ask about that as well.
For instance, the Anglican Church, speaking globally, have been okay with legalization for medicinal purposes. We've seen the wisdom, we've followed the science on that. We were not against the decriminalization, considering how it adversely affects some of these young boys and so on. Legalization, however, for recreational use, which is kind of where we're going, is a whole different matter. And like I said, we are looking at down the road and the effects on society, the effects on the young, and we're not convinced we have done a proper review of all of that to ensure that we can do this thing properly.
Let me just stick a pin there, because that's a critical point to differentiate. You speak of the recreational use of marijuana, and that is already allowed for. The 2017, the changes made in 2017 with the decriminalization of 10 grams of marijuana allows for any person to be able to possess marijuana and to consume it in their private homes. They have stipulations that they must be away from children, away from school zones, and it's already allowed for. What this proposal is what is being proposed at this time is making what essentially would be considered a legal contraband, giving it a process to be able to be used. So you can have it, but you can't buy it, you can't grow it, you can't import it. So it's illegal to get it, but legal to have it. And it's essentially filling that gap, because it doesn't make any logical sense.
You see, one of the things we have to look at, Melanie, is the whole, and while you're saying that, we have to also look at the whole aspect of, and though I hear you saying that, yes, there were some measures and there were some things in place before, in society, and especially in the thinking of rational people, we have to be careful not to begin to think about opening something as a Pandora box. And in society, what sometimes is said comes across, and I'm saying this because I have lived in other Caribbean countries. I have seen the effects of these things in other Caribbean countries. I have seen the effects of these things, especially amongst the student population of our countries. And what I'm saying is that, especially at that level, when it is heard, okay, it is okay, and it might be okay in one respect, and it might be said in one respect, but when we hear that word, it is okay, it is opening a Pandora box for anything and everything to take place. And that, for us as a church, also have to be kept in check, especially insofar as society is concerned, because in a sense we also speak for society. So while that can be said, we also have to be careful that in speaking about some things, it doesn't become a Pandora box for anything and everything. And that has to be a concern.
I think one of the questions one would like to have answered, to have an answer to, is what change would the churches like to see in terms of what was being proposed in order for the church to change its position?
I can speak to that. One of the areas that I think can be looked at, and this again is research that has been done and I continue to say in the Caribbean, and I know why I'm saying that, because I am more concerned about what affects us in Belize and what affects us in the Caribbean as a people. And while I might be concerned about the others, I want to begin there. That research has taken place, especially in Jamaica, where for the medicinal aspect, the drugs has done well. And I think as a country, if we can more move in that direction, that perhaps the church might be able to take a second look at some of these things. And so in the initial aspect of it, I was saying that perhaps it is, if we can move in that direction.
Strictly medicinal.
Strictly medicinal. It is something that the church would be able to look at.
Okay.
And I think when we talk about gaps too, sometimes it might be convenient to just look at the legal gaps. But we are seeing other gaps. We are seeing social effect gaps. And we're seeing the impact on families and individuals. We have a lot to learn from legalizing tobacco and alcohol, you know. We've been down this road before. And there are some lessons to be learned from even the current abuse. Because I am sure, I wasn't wrong, but I'm sure when tobacco and alcohol were legalized, there were some beautiful arguments put forward as to why this is. And we've seen the side effects. Trust me, we've seen the side effects. We're just saying that here we are again at a point where we're going to legalize a drug. Have we given enough thought, not just to the legal gaps, but to the societal gaps, the managerial gaps, the monitoring gaps, and so on. And we have to be real in our context as well, the context of Belize and the resources we have to police these things and to ensure equity. And we are just not convinced, I must say, at this point. That so when you ask what do we may not yet have looked at that document to say, well, specifically we would want you to change this. We are still coming from a point of let's look at this as a society, as a community, and how it impacts. And let's make sure we understand those realities to then see how they could be properly reflected in a document that moves towards legalization. That's all we're saying, because remember, the church's perspective is always from what impacts people's lives. That's where we often enter the fray, you know. When people's lives, when families are affected, when an abused spouse calls, and so on. And we're not saying that the legislators and so on don't pay attention to things like that, but on the ground, I hope you can appreciate that those are issues that matter a lot to us.
You know, I think this is a conversation that requires looking at it from the holistic perspective.
That's correct.
And so it's looking at it from the benefits that it will bring to the economy. It's looking at the societal effects that it will have, but also looking at the criminal justice aspect. We're trying to push for criminal justice reform, policies in our country, and how we could sort of lessen the backlog that's affecting the criminal justice system, particularly the courts, and just the amount of cases that's showing up in front of the courts for possession of drugs, and the backlog that's happening with people in remand in the prison system. And so I think perhaps one of the arguments of the government would be that the legalization would now not have penalties be placed on people who cultivate the drug, and therefore you could enter the market. If you look globally, a lot of the movements across the world, I studied in Canada for 2 years, it's completely legal in Canada, and they found ways how to develop mechanisms to ensure that it's properly executed. But the only way to do that would be to start. And there is a starting point, and there are certain lessons that you will learn throughout that journey. So my question is, what's the position of the churches in terms of how this impacts, beyond just the effects, the psychological effects that it will have on individuals, but rather also the position, the impact it will have on criminal justice, for example?
Well, I think that's an important point, because we know in this country how strained the whole legal system is. And without careful consideration, we may want to ask the question, will this aid or not on that, even just on that strain on the legal system, for instance. So that's one aspect, I think, we certainly have to consider. Now, I hear you, when you say this could be the start of the process towards where we want to go. But true to what we are saying here this morning, well, let's have some more conversation about even this start. And we don't feel we've had enough of a conversation to say, okay, we're at this point, fine, but let's have a serious conversation, not only about this point, but a little ways down. For instance, I'll tell you quickly, I listened to a show not long ago, not on your station, another station, and they were talking about marijuana. But I was taken aback a bit, for instance, when the talk seemed to be solely around smoking marijuana. And we know that this thing can enter the body in various different ways. Some young people showed me tableta, fudge.
Oh, yeah.
And I think even the science is saying that when it enters other than through the lungs or so on, it has a different kind of effect, a more drawn out effect and all. Have we brought all of that to bear on the conversation as well? And that conversation that night didn't touch that. So again, what we're saying here is, to your point about the holistic, the broader concept, yeah, let's have some conversation. Let's have conversations with the legal profession then.
But I wanna just at least clarify that there have been conversations regarding the type of marijuana, and also looking at what it will contain. The whole reason there is a differentiation between hemp and cannabis, which is really what words we should be using, is because of talking about the different levels of, for example, THC, and those that can have a psychological effect on a person. Now, speaking with the professor that studies in medicinal marijuana use in Jamaica, speaking with the consultant that has been working with the government here in Belize, and even speaking to some of the government representatives, these are things that have been given consideration. So I suppose it goes back to your point that if you come to the table and you perhaps hear that there are considerations being made for the type of marijuana or the type of cannabis that will be cultivated in Belize, how it will be distributed, because the question of whether or not people use it, it seems moot. The 2017 has passed. Decriminalization, prior to decriminalization, people were using marijuana. Since the decriminalization, people are allowed to use marijuana. Any person who's an adult who chooses to do so within the confines of what the law says, which is in your home. So it really just is about putting in the structures. So my question is it simply that you have been left out of the conversation and perhaps not allowed to understand the details of measures or careful measures that are being thought of and considered as they move forward? Do you think that is a part of the issue on the table here?
Well, in speaking to that issue, I'm certain that it is not only the church that might be concerned about that. There are, I can almost put my finger on it, that there would be other organizations who would be as concerned about some level of, and what kind of dialogue is taking place insofar as it might affect them and what they do whether it is with young people or it might be the psychological effect. I'm certain that counselors might also be as concerned about this. So for us, it is not only that, to put it, that the church has not had that kind of consultation or dialogue, but we also, as you mentioned, let us look at the holistic aspect of it. And have we had the kind of communication with other organizations also to have been able to come to a proper conclusion? These are some of the things I think we're talking about. So it is not only consultation with the church as such, but I think other bodies would also be as concerned about some of the things. And as Bishop Wright has said, because how will it affect us in the long term? And those are some of the things I think that must be taken into consideration.
And if I may quickly, I mean, Bishop is right. We don't see ourselves as the only group, obviously, that needs it. But to the point we made at the start, too, the conversation necessary, it must also not be one where we just sit there, okay, and you come and you justify to us why you want to do this, and lay out all your facts. And a true conversation is hearing the other side too, our concerns too. So yes, you bring the facts, you lay out all the medical stuff, and we appreciate it, and it might enlighten us. But I think we do a little reading too, right? But in a true conversation, it's also hearing the other side and their concern and the issues that they already seen, in spite of all the science, in spite of all the statistics and so on, because there are other voices out there, in addition to these experts, that hopefully are also being listened to. There are other voices, reputable voices, that are sounding caution, that are saying, make sure you attend to these things as well. So it's about the relationship. It's about the necessary conversations and the nature of those conversations and the manner of those conversations that are also important to us, is what we're trying to say here.
I want to go even further in terms of the decision-making process, because I understand that the evangelicals might have one position and the other denominations might share another position.
That's correct.
How is it that the churches, what mechanism is there for the churches to come to a conclusion and not prolong that process of democracy?
Well, you said prolong the process of democracy, but actually we live in a pluralistic society, and everybody have their different opinions and understanding of something. So does the church. We, over the years, have had that kind of communication with each other. In the long run, I must say that we might not necessarily all agree to come to a certain specific decision. But what, for example, I feel comfortable with as a senator as I go to Senate is that I try to do as much consultation as is possible across the board with those to whom I answer to. Now, even in going to Senate, and there might be things to vote on, I might not necessarily, as I seek consultation, I might not necessarily be able to get a general agreement across the board. But as I go, at least there is a fair amount of understanding. Having consulted as to when I go into the Senate, I know exactly what to be able to speak on and the decision to be made. And so I answer you in that way. We might not necessarily agree on everything, but in the long run, having had enough consultation with each other, there are some things that we can put on the board.
No, and it's very evident from the conversations. I mean, you brought a lot of clarity to what has been put forward in this press release, because it's easy to kind of just see a natural divide, for and against. But what I hear in this conversation, and correct me if I'm wrong, is not, you don't have a firm stance against this process of eventually legalizing marijuana. That's what I hear being communicated. You've mentioned an openness to medicinal marijuana, and you have expressed that if you could be able to come to the table and discuss what mechanisms and regulations will be in place, that there is a sense of openness for future decision making.
And I think that's a fair thing. We don't know what that future decision might be that we can agree to. But yes, there's nothing here which says absolutely not, you know, kind of thing. But we just don't feel we're quite there yet, and we need to have these conversations. We need to have these open, honest conversations in order to be able to get to that point. And if I may quickly chime in, you know, you're right. You know, I always remind folks, that's why we have denominations, eh? That's why my good friend here is a Methodist, I'm an Anglican,
Yes.
Marlene is Roman Catholic, I think. Trust me, that will not change anytime soon. I think, I just think the Lord is going to come.
What, your religion? People do it all the time.
I just think that when the Lord returns, He'll have to somehow figure out how to. So, but Bishop is right as well in that, notwithstanding that fact, and we're not here to say there's no reason why you also cannot come to the consensus and say these are the things that matter. Not always from a theological or strictly religious, but from a societal standpoint, from a human standpoint, from a health standpoint. I think there are grounds where even though we have denominational differences, there's no reason why the church can't come together and say, hey, no, this doesn't look good, or this is better, or so on. But if I may quickly add to Marlene, and that is why we are here to also talk about the relationship. I know it sounds like, because are we seeing in all of this parameters, boundaries, you know, to this relationship? And if that is the case, then we also need to be clear about that.
Well, I wanted to ask that question subsequently, because you earlier, and I want to touch on the salary cuts issue as well. You spoke of the ongoing relationship you've had with the education ministry. Since you have put forward your position on marijuana, have you been engaged or sought to be engaged with the persons who are right behind the legislation? And in this case, it's the Ministry of Home Affairs and New Growth.
Yeah, we're hoping to indeed, yes. Okay. And we have certainly opened ourselves to that possibility, because we're not here just to talk about this. We really would want to do something about it for the good of the country. That's how we frame it. So yes. And so we're hoping in the weeks and months ahead, Bishop, to meet with the Prime Minister, to continue to meet with the Minister of Education, Home Affairs, and talk through some of these issues. And hopefully both sides can gain a greater understanding of each other's position, or where each other is coming from. And the hope is that out of that can come what might be called some kind of consensus or greater understanding. We know we are not the government. we don't make the laws. We don't. At the end of the day, that's their responsibility. We know that. You know, we're not pretending that we don't. We're just saying, if you see us as a viable, worthwhile partner, stakeholder in all of this, as we say we do, right? Then that should also translate into dialogue and conversation and consultation and so on. That's basically what we're saying.
What's the feedback you get from the members of your church? Is it mixed?
Oh yeah, it's always mixed. Remember, the church is just a sample of society, and all the strong emotions that are visible in other places can become quite visible in the church. And so I think as responsible leaders, we hear them, we give space for that expression, but we also know that, like you rightly say, you can extend this thing forever and ever, talking. At some point somebody has to say, well, this is it. And so even with our membership, we listen, but at the end of the day, you know, as leaders, as a good colleague of mine always says, just remember the church is not a democracy. You don't vote on what is sin and what is not sin, you know. It's not like this is a popularity. But that does not mean you are a dictatorial leader, or
right.
You know what I mean? You know,
at a certain point, you have to make a decision.
You have to make a decision. You have to take a position, and hopefully you explain it to your people, and you've had enough internal conversations as well, so that you get a sense of where people. And on these issues, trust me. I know for us, St. John's Cathedral, and we're not far from where the impact of the legalization of marijuana will come to the fore of, you know. So I know some of these guys are members of the church, looking forward to it too. One the other day.
And I mean, where you're situated, and yes. Even further down, you see the impact of the turf war that takes place mostly precisely. Because of the illegality of it.
And fair enough,
yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that comes out of what can take place in time to come also. Because even as we begin to think about legalization of it, mm-hmm. who are the people involved? Who will be the big players? Mm-hmm. As against, quote unquote, the small man. And that is already playing out in that aspect, turf war. And later on, when it comes onto the full legality of it, you know, who's allowed to grow, yeah. who's allowed to produce, etc. That in itself will also become an aspect that we have to contend with yeah. in time to come.
Mm-hmm. That's a concern that we've heard quite a bit so
absolutely.
far. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, I don't want to lose all the time that I have with you speaking only on the marijuana yes. issue. Yes. Let's talk about how you have also used this opportunity to speak about the salary cuts for teachers. I understand that you, the Council of Churches, felt offended by the words of the Prime Minister when they seem to be putting off the blame on the teachers' cut on the managing authorities. Let me get your response there.
Well, I think that's how we felt it when we first heard it, you know, mm-hmm. because the Prime Minister did have an audience with us mm-hmm. and explain the reasons behind why the cut was going to be necessary. And true to our own sense of why we do what we do, the concept of a shared sacrifice was a big part of us saying, yes, I think this is the way to go, because mm-hmm. we're all in this together. And if we are to get out of it together, the economic crunch or whatever, we have to do it together. And part of that process is a shared. So we were made to understand that, you know, everybody is prepared to take the 10% cut. Mm-hmm. This is the way forward. This is necessary. There's no other option. We sign on to that. I think our
that's correct.
Yes. in the Senate got up and spoke to the shared sacrifice aspect of this thing. Mm-hmm. And then to hear things subsequently that sounded different than that, you know, that perhaps the 10% was simply something that was passed on, and that such a decision was made more at the managerial level rather than the ministerial level.
So let's just explain it further. Basically, the government contribution towards the managing authority has been cut by 10%. And there's a natural understanding or an agreement that this would then be the 10% cut that the managing authority will then implement on teachers that work in schools managed by the churches.
Right.
And that is what is now being explained.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And while I can appreciate that perhaps as a part of, and this is where again communication is an important aspect. Because how you communicate, what you want to communicate, I think is important. And perhaps in fairness to those you would like to bring on board, it is important that as you communicate a certain aspect, because this is what you would like to get across, there should be clarity. And insofar as clarity is concerned, it is not that we have to go and read the fine print in order to find out about some things. The fine print should be upfront. And while we can appreciate of what was said after, there were some things that perhaps should have been said initially. And that aspect you just made reference to, so that then managing authorities would have been able to sit down and say, okay, we need to be able to properly work this out. But in addition to that, Eleni, bearing in mind that there are also some other aspects that I became aware of, whether in Senate or we would have heard of afterwards. That when we the understanding we had of shared sacrifice would that it would have been, as I said, across the board,
Yeah.
everybody.
So what you're talking about is the fact that the CEOs and some members of the
That is
judiciary-
one, yeah, those are one set of people. And then we would have subsequently heard about, okay, increased salary for this person or increased salary for the other person. There's something not playing out right there. And so that would have come to our attention. And as it would have come to the public's attention. And we felt that it was something that we had to address, especially in light of the decision that we had taken as church, leaders, that it was important in order to come out and to be able to clarify what we understood and what actually is our position.
Would you have had a different position in the Senate on the 10% salary cut if you knew there would be persons exempted or persons who got an increased salary?
Milling, I have always consulted with those with whom I need to consult. And based on the decision that we all make collectively together, that is the decision that I take to Senate.
Yeah. No, but if you knew that there were persons who were not going to get the 10% cut within the government system, do you think there would have been a different thought process in making that decision?
I'm pretty certain there would have been, because it would not have come across as shared sacrifice the way we understood it. Because we have lived this shared sacrifice too, not to sound, but I have taken my own cut across the board in our church, for instance, just so that we didn't have to fire anybody. And we all decided we got to do this. So we were speaking strictly out of, as Bishop said, across the board, shared sacrifice. And so if something other than that was presented to us at the time, I don't think we would have been as comfortable saying, okay, yeah, go ahead, okay, we understand the exceptions. Now, in our upcoming conversation with the Prime Minister, we are hoping to indeed be enlightened and hopefully gain a better understanding. But we hold to the fact that we bought into this, if you will, under the understanding that this is shared sacrifice. This is something we're all going to have to go through in order to see a better day down the road. Yeah.
Bishops, we are just running out of time. This conversation is one that we could continue on and on for to have really and truly engaging discourse about. But we thank you for joining us this morning. Is there any last thing that you would like to say?
Yes, one of the last things that I would like to say, based on some other things that perhaps would not have come up this morning, but one of the things that we need to, and we have been taking note of and engaging, is constitutional reform. And that is something that I personally, as a senator, that at least in my closing remarks, I would like to also suggest that going forward, we will have to pay attention to, and for us as a church, along with some other social partners, we will continue to push that issue, because we feel at this point in time, as it involves some other things, that constitutional reform and constitutional review needs to take place.
Yeah. And I would just want to say we're just about a month or so away from celebrating 40 years as an independent. And I just feel that we need to begin to really show our maturity as a nation, 40 years in the making of independence. And part of that maturity has to mean that we can have this kind of conversation respectfully. Yeah. We may differ, but we can still leave not being enemies or that I am against you and you against me, but just that we have had the opportunity to put on the table how we feel, and hopefully we can walk away from that better understanding each other and maybe having a greater appreciation of actually what we share in common. And I hope that what we are doing here, what we're trying to do with the administration and so on, is all part of this maturing, if you will.
That's correct.
As a people. Because you and I know we live in a great and beautiful land, and we are thankful to God for that, and so let's show our appreciation.
Yeah.
Bishop Wright, Bishop Bengushe, thank you for joining us.
Thank
we
you
go
for
ahead
having
and we
us.
take our first break, and when we come back, we will be joined by members from the KHMH to speak about the opening of the oncology unit. Stay with us.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.